Blood ran down the Vampire King's pale wrist as he forced it between the dying maid's lips, watching her fading pulse with eyes that had seen empires crumble. Lysandra Thornhill had always known she was fragile. The doctors called it a rare blood disorder, something with too many syllables that meant her body attacked itself from the inside out. She'd spent most of her 23 years learning to live small, to move carefully through a world that seemed determined to break her. Working as a maid at the Crimson Estate had been a compromise. Quiet work, steady income, and housing included in a sprawling mansion so old it still had servants' quarters. She'd never expected to stumble into the secret that lived beneath it. It had started 3 weeks ago when she'd taken a wrong turn while carrying fresh linens to the 3rd floor. The eastern corridor wasn't supposed to exist according to the house plans, but there it was, a hallway lined with portraits of pale figures in centuries-old dress, their eyes seeming to follow her movement. At the end stood a door carved with symbols she didn't recognize, and because Lysandra had always been curious despite her caution, she'd pressed her ear against the wood. Voices, many of them speaking in a language that sounded like Latin mixed with something older, something that made her teeth ache. And beneath it all, a sound like running water that her instinct screamed was not water at all. She'd run then, back to her small room, and told herself she'd imagined it. The estate was strange. Everyone who worked there knew it. The owner never appeared during daylight hours. Deliveries only came after sunset. The few guests who visited always arrived in black cars with tinted windows so dark they seemed to absorb light. But Lysandra had needed the job, needed the health insurance that came with it, so she'd ignored the strangeness and focused on her work. Until tonight, when her body had finally decided it was done. She'd been turning down the beds in the west wing when the dizziness hit. Not unusual, she'd learned to recognize the warning signs, the way her vision would tunnel and her legs would turn to water. Usually she could sit down, put her head between her knees, and wait it out. But this time was different. This time her heart had stuttered in her chest like a bird hitting glass, and she'd felt something vital tear loose inside her. She'd collapsed between a 4-poster bed and an antique wardrobe, alone in a room that smelled of roses and old wood. Her phone was in her pocket, but her fingers wouldn't cooperate, wouldn't grip, wouldn't move. Blood trickled from her nose, never a good sign, and her vision had started to gray at the edges. This is it, she'd thought with a strange calm. This is how I die. Alone in a rich person's guest room, bleeding on an imported carpet. Then the door had opened, and everything had changed. The man who entered moved like liquid shadow, crossing the room faster than her failing eyes could track. One moment the doorway was empty, the next he was kneeling beside her, and Lysandra's first coherent thought was that he was the most beautiful and terrifying thing she'd ever seen. White hair fell past his shoulders, so pale it seemed to glow in the lamplight. His skin was alabaster, smooth and unmarked, stretched over features that could have been carved from marble by a master sculptor. High cheekbones, a straight nose, lips that were surprisingly full, but it was his eyes that held her crimson, the color of fresh blood, with an intelligence in them that felt ancient. "Ah, foolish girl," he'd said, his voice accented with something she couldn't place. "How long have you been dying?" She'd tried to answer, but blood had bubbled up instead of words. He'd made a sound of frustration, and she'd seen his teeth elongated canines that confirmed what her shock-muddled brain had already begun to suspect. Vampire? The estate's mysterious owner was a vampire, and she was dying in front of him. "You should have told someone," he'd continued, lifting her with impossible gentleness until her head rested against his chest. He was cold, she'd noticed, not ice-cold like in stories, but cool like marble on a winter morning. Should have asked for help before it came to this? She'd wanted to laugh. Help from whom? The other maids who barely spoke to her? The stern housekeeper who'd made it clear Lysandra was only employed out of pity? The mysterious employer she'd never met? Her heart had stuttered again, missing 2 beats this time, and she'd felt something fundamental begin to slip away. The vampire's eyes had widened, and for a moment she'd seen something almost like panic cross his perfect features. "No," he'd said firmly, as if he could command death itself to halt. "No, you don't have my permission to die." Then he'd raised his wrist to his mouth, and she'd watched in detached fascination as his own teeth tore open his pale flesh. Blood welled up, darker than human blood, almost black in the low light. It should have been horrifying, but Lysandra's brain had moved past horror into a strange acceptance of the surreal. The Vampire King, because surely only royalty could move with such innate authority, had pressed his bleeding wrist to her lips, and his voice had dropped to a command that resonated in her bones. "Drink." The blood had touched her tongue, and liquid fire had poured down her throat. Every nerve ending in Lysandra's body had ignited at once. The blood didn't taste like she'd expected, not metallic and bitter, but rich and complex, like dark wine and something wilder, something that tasted of midnight and ancient power. It burned going down, but it was the burn of life returning, of systems that had been shutting down suddenly roaring back to function. Her heart had clenched, then beat, once, twice, strong and steady like it hadn't been in months. More, the vampire had urged, his other hand cradling her head. Take more, your body needs it. She'd drunk because her instincts had screamed at her to drink, because something in his blood called to the dying parts of her and promised salvation. The weakness that had been her constant companion for years had begun to recede, like a tide pulling back from shore. Strength had flooded into muscles that had always been too tired, too fragile. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, he'd gently pulled his wrist away. She'd made a sound of protest, some animal part of her brain wanting more of that incredible vitality, but he'd shaken his head. Enough for now. Too much and the change will begin, and that is not a choice I will make for you without consent. Lysandra had blinked up at him, her vision clearer than it had been in years. She could see every detail of his face, now the faint pattern in his irises like cracks in rubies, the way his white hair caught the light, the ancient weariness around his eyes that spoke of centuries witnessed. "Who are you?" she'd managed to whisper, her voice hoarse but functional. "Constantine Elverich," he'd answered, and the name had resonated with power. King of the Northern bloodline, Lord of the Crimson Court, and apparently the fool who cannot bear to watch his newest maid die on his guest room floor. She'd laughed, which had been a mistake because her body, while no longer dying, was still recovering. The laugh had turned into a cough, and Constantine had frowned, lifting her completely off the floor as if she weighed nothing. "You need rest and more blood. Not mine, you've had enough of that. Real food, iron supplements, and time for your body to repair what my blood has jump-started." "I'm still dying," Lysandra had said, reality crashing back in. "This is just temporary, isn't it? My disorder, it's genetic, it's being burned out of your system as we speak," Constantine had interrupted, carrying her out of the guest room and down the hallway with ground-eating strides. "Vampire blood is many things, Miss Thornhill. A temporary fix is not one of them. What I gave you will hunt down every malfunctioning cell in your body and repair it. Your blood disorder is already dying. In 3 days, it will be completely gone." Hope had surged in her chest, so sharp it was almost painful. "That's not possible." The doctor said, "Your doctors are human and limited by human medicine. I am neither." He'd looked down at her, and something had softened in those crimson eyes. "You will live, little maid. I have decided it." "You don't get to just decide things like that," she'd protested weakly, even as relief had made her dizzy. "I am a king. Deciding things is precisely what I do." He'd carried her to a room she'd never seen before, not in the servants' quarters, but in what must have been the private wing. The bedroom was enormous, decorated in deep reds and blacks, with a bed large enough to sleep 5 people. Floor-to-ceiling windows were covered with blackout curtains so thick they looked like they could stop bullets. Constantine had laid her on the bed with surprising gentleness, then stepped back as if he didn't trust himself too close to her. "Rest now. I'll have food brought to you. Real food, not the thin soup the kitchen staff have been eating. You need protein and iron." Lysandra had struggled to sit up. "I should get back to work. The other rooms need." "You are relieved of your duties as a maid," Constantine had said flatly. "Consider yourself reassigned." "To what?" He'd paused at the door, and when he'd looked back at her, there had been something complicated in his expression, something that might have been wonder or might have been concern. I'm not certain yet, but we'll need to discuss what happens next, what my blood will do to you, and what you want from the life I've just given back to you." He'd hesitated, then added more quietly, "And we'll need to discuss what you heard in the eastern corridor 3 weeks ago." Her blood had run cold. "You knew?" "I know everything that happens in my estate, Miss Thornhill. Sleep now. We'll speak tomorrow evening." Then he'd been gone, moving with that impossible vampire speed, and Lysandra had been left alone in a room that belonged in a Gothic romance novel, her mind spinning and her body humming with borrowed vitality. She'd fallen asleep still trying to process everything, and had dreamed of blood and crimson eyes. The next evening, Lysandra had woken to find her small room in the servants' quarters had been emptied. Every possession she owned had been moved to the luxurious bedroom Constantine had placed her in. A note in elegant handwriting informed her that her meals would be brought to her 3 times a day until her strength fully returned, and that the king requested her presence in his study at sunset. The formality of it would have been funny if she hadn't been terrified. A maid she didn't recognize, a girl with the same pale skin and knowing eyes as Constantine, had brought breakfast. Real breakfast: eggs, bacon, fresh fruit, bread still warm from the oven. Lysandra had eaten like she was starving, which she supposed she had been for months without fully realizing it. The vampire maid had watched her with undisguised curiosity. "He saved you," she'd said in a voice that carried the hint of an accent. "The king himself. Do you understand how unusual that is?" Lysandra had swallowed a mouthful of eggs. "I'm beginning to get the picture that I stumbled into something complicated." "Complicated?" The maid had smiled, revealing delicate fangs. "That's one word for it. I'm Celestine, by the way. I've served the king for 73 years, and I've never seen him give his blood to save a human. Not once." "Maybe he just didn't want to lose an employee," Lysandra had offered weakly. Celestine's laugh had been like bells. "Sweet girl, he's had hundreds of employees over the centuries. He's watched them age and die without intervention. Whatever his reason for saving you, it wasn't about losing a maid." That had sat in Lysandra's stomach like a stone for the rest of the day. She'd spent the hours until sunset exploring her new room, finding her clothes hung in a wardrobe that could have held 10 times her meager wardrobe, her few books arranged on built-in shelves, her toiletries placed in a bathroom with a tub large enough to swim in. Someone had also left new clothes, expensive things in her size, dresses that looked like they belonged in period dramas, all dark velvets and intricate lacing. She'd chosen the simplest one, a deep burgundy that made her pale skin look less sickly and her dark hair less mousy. When sunset came, Celestine had returned to guide her to Constantine's study. The walk had taken them deeper into the estate, past the secret eastern corridor and down a staircase that seemed to descend far longer than the house's architecture should allow. "We're going underground," Lysandra had realized. "The true estate exists below," Celestine had confirmed. "What humans see above is just the entrance. The Crimson Court has been here for 400 years, built into the bedrock beneath the city, a kingdom hidden in plain sight." The staircase had opened into a vast underground chamber that had stolen Lysandra's breath. Vaulted ceilings arched overhead, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to move in the torchlight. Columns of black marble supported the weight of the world above, and everywhere, vampires. They'd moved through the space with preternatural grace, dressed in everything from ancient formal wear to modern suits, their white hair and pale skin making them look like living statues. Conversations had stopped as Lysandra passed. Crimson eyes had tracked her movement with predatory interest. "Don't look them in the eye," Celestine had whispered. "You're under the king's protection, but don't challenge them." "What am I doing here?" Lysandra had whispered back, fear finally catching up to her wonder. "That's for the king to explain." Constantine's study had been at the heart of the underground palace, behind doors carved with the same strange symbols she'd seen before. Celestine had knocked once, then retreated, leaving Lysandra alone when that deep voice called, "Enter." The room beyond had been part library, part throne room. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling, thousands of them in hundreds of languages. A massive desk dominated the center, carved from a single piece of dark wood that looked older than countries. And behind it, standing with his back to her as he gazed at a map of the world, had been Constantine. He'd been dressed differently than the night before, no longer in the simple dark clothes, but in formal attire that screamed royalty. A long coat of midnight blue over a vest embroidered with silver thread. His white hair had been pulled back, revealing the sharp lines of his face. When he'd turned to face her, Lysandra's breath had caught. He was devastatingly beautiful, in a way that didn't seem entirely real. Beauty that was meant to lure and hypnotize, predators camouflaged to draw in prey. But his eyes, those crimson eyes, had held something more than hunger when they'd settled on her. "Miss Thornhill, I trust you're feeling better?" She'd nodded, not trusting her voice. "Please, sit." He'd gestured to a chair across from his desk, waiting until she'd settled before taking his own seat. For a long moment he'd simply studied her, and she'd had the uncomfortable feeling of being assessed, catalogued, and filed away in that ancient mind. "You have questions," he'd finally said. "Ask them." Where did she even start? Is everything Celestine told me true? This place, the court, the kingdom under the city? Yes. The Crimson Court is one of 7 major vampire sanctuaries worldwide. We've existed here since the city was barely a settlement. We've watched it grow up around us, adapted to each era, and maintained our secrecy through careful management and, when necessary, compelling influence. Compelling? Mind magic, limited but effective. Most humans who stumble onto our secrets forget them by morning. His eyes had narrowed slightly. You proved resistant when I tried it 3 weeks ago. An interesting quality. So you'd tried to make her forget. Why didn't it work? I don't know. Perhaps your illness created some neurological difference. Perhaps you simply have a strong will. Either way, it meant I had to take other precautions. Like assigning me to the West Wing where I'd never stumble onto anything supernatural again? A faint smile had touched his lips. Precisely. I'd hoped you would simply finish your employment contract and leave without incident. Then last night happened, and I found myself with a choice: let you die, or save you and bind you permanently to this world. Bind me how? The fear had crept back into her voice. Constantine had leaned forward, his expression serious. My blood is in you now, Lysandra. It's healing you, yes, but it's also changing you. Not into a vampire. You'd need to die and rise again for that. But you're not entirely human anymore either. You'll live longer than you should, age slower. Your senses are already sharper. I can see it in the way you track sounds in this room. And you'll be able to sense vampires now, feel our presence like a cold wind. She'd processed that, her mind racing. So I'm what? Something in between? We call them thralls, though that term has ugly connotations. You're blood-marked, connected to me specifically since it was my blood you consumed. It will fade eventually, if not renewed. But it takes years, sometimes decades. And in the meantime? In the meantime, you cannot leave the estate. He'd said it gently but firmly. Other vampires will sense my mark on you. Some will respect it. Others will see you as a curiosity or a challenge. And there are those who would hurt you to hurt me. I have enemies, Lysandra. Centuries of them. The cage had snapped shut around her, and Lysandra had felt panic rise in her throat. So I'm a prisoner. You're protected, he'd corrected. There's a difference. Is there? She'd stood, needing to move, to pace. You saved my life, and I'm grateful. But you can't just keep me locked in your underground kingdom because it's convenient. Convenient? Constantine's voice had dropped to something dangerous, and he'd been standing suddenly, moving around the desk faster than she could follow. You think this is convenient for me? Having a fragile human marked with my blood? Living in my court where every vampire with ambition will wonder what you mean to me? Where my enemies will plot ways to use you against me? Then why did you do it? She'd shouted, surprised by her own anger. Why save me if it's such a problem? He'd been right in front of her now, close enough that she could feel the coolness radiating from his skin. His eyes had been blazing, twin rubies lit from within. Because I couldn't watch you die, he'd said, voice raw with something that sounded almost like pain. Because in 70 years of running this estate, you were the only human who looked at my portraits and smiled instead of shivering. Because you left little notes of encouragement in the books in the library, thinking no one read them, not knowing I found every single one. Because for 3 weeks I've been aware of every breath you take in my house, and the thought of those breaths stopping was unacceptable. Lysandra had stared at him, her heart pounding. You noticed me? I notice everything in my domain, he'd said, but his voice had softened. But yes, I noticed you particularly. The air between them had felt charged, heavy with possibility and danger in equal measure. Lysandra had known she should step back, put distance between herself and this ancient, powerful creature. Instead, she'd found herself asking, what happens now? Constantine had seemed to shake himself, stepping back and running a hand through his white hair. Now you learn what it means to live in the Crimson Court. You'll need training how to move among vampires safely, how to recognize threats, how to use the abilities my blood has given you, and... He'd hesitated, something almost vulnerable crossing his face. And we'll need to determine what role you'll take here. I meant it when I said you're no longer a maid. What else would I be? That depends on what you want. Some blood-marked humans become advisors. Your mortal perspective can be valuable to beings who've been immortal for centuries. Some become scholars, given access to our libraries and histories. Some, he'd cut himself off, looking away. Some what? Some become companions, partners to the vampires who mark them. But that is not an expectation, he'd added quickly. I saved you because I chose to, not because I expect anything in return." But Lysandra had heard the loneliness in his voice, had seen it in the way he stood apart even in his own court. How long did someone live before everyone they'd ever known turned to dust? How many times could you watch the world change before you stopped trying to be part of it? "Teach me," she'd said impulsively. "Teach me about this world, about what I've become, and then I'll decide what I want." He'd looked at her with something that might have been hope. "Very well, we begin tomorrow." The next weeks had passed in a blur of lessons and revelations. Constantine had assigned Celestine as her guide to court etiquette, but he'd taken her education upon himself personally. Every evening after sunset, Lysandra had found herself in his study or walking the underground gardens that bloomed in eternal moonlight, learning the secret history of the world. Vampires, she'd learned, were older than civilization. They'd been there when humans built their first cities, sometimes as gods, sometimes as demons, always as something other. The great vampire lines, northern, southern, eastern, western, the Crimson Court, the Shadow Assembly, and the Twilight Conclave had divided the world among themselves in an ancient treaty that predated written language. Constantine was over 800 years old. He'd been born Constantine Elverish in medieval times, turned at 28 during a plague that had devastated his village. His sire had been a vampire queen who'd seen potential in a lord's son dying of disease. She'd made him, trained him, and then been destroyed in a purge 300 years ago, leaving Constantine as the last of her direct bloodline and the inheritor of her territory. He told her all of this clinically, as if reciting history that had happened to someone else. But Lysandra had learned to read the small tells, the way his jaw tightened when he mentioned his sire, the distant look in his eyes when he spoke of the purge, the careful way he avoided talking about the loneliness of being the last. In return, she'd told him about her life, the ordinary mundane details of a human existence, growing up in foster care because her parents had died when she was young, the diagnosis at 15 that had slowly stolen her strength, the series of jobs she'd held and lost because her body couldn't keep up, the desperate application to the Crimson Estate because it was the only place that would hire her despite her medical history. I thought I was lucky to get the job," she'd said with a bitter laugh. "Turns out I was walking into a vampire court and didn't even know it." Perhaps it was fate, Constantine had suggested, and she'd caught something in his tone that made her look at him sharply. Do vampires believe in fate? This one is beginning to. The court had slowly accepted her presence, though Lysandra had never shaken the feeling of being watched. Vampires would pause their conversations when she passed, crimson eyes tracking her movement with predatory interest. Some nodded respectfully. She was the king's blood-marked, after all. Others looked at her with barely concealed hunger or calculation. Celestine had proven to be both guide and unexpected friend. The vampire woman had been turned during the Victorian era and retained the mannerisms of that time, but she'd adapted to each passing age with apparent ease. She'd taught Lysandra how to walk through the court with her head high, how to deflect unwanted attention, how to identify which vampires were dangerous and which were merely curious. "Lord Draven," Celestine had whispered one evening, nodding subtly toward a tall vampire with white hair braided with silver. "Old Southern line, guest of the king. He's watching you because you're a curiosity, a human who survived the king's blood and remains human. He won't harm you, but don't be alone with him. He likes to test boundaries." "And her?" Lysandra had asked, indicating a female vampire in a gown that looked like it was made of shadows. "Lady Seraphine. She's been trying to court the king for 2 centuries. She sees you as competition." That had made Lysandra laugh. "Competition? I'm just the only person the king has shown personal interest in since his sire died," Celestine had interrupted gently. "Don't underestimate what that means, Lysandra, or how dangerous it makes you to those who want his attention." But the real danger, as it turned out, came from outside the court. Lysandra had been in the underground gardens, a sprawling space of night-blooming flowers and trees that somehow grew without sunlight when she'd felt it a presence that made the mark on her soul burn cold. Not Constantine's familiar chill, but something different, something wrong. She'd turned to find 3 vampires she didn't recognize, standing between her and the garden entrance. They were pale, like all vampires, but their white hair was matted, their clothes torn and stained. And their eyes were wrong, not the controlled crimson of the court vampires, but wild and red, like fresh wounds. "The king's little pet," one had hissed, voice like gravel. "All alone in the garden. How careless." Lysandra had backed away, remembering Celestine's training. Never run, it triggers the chase instinct. Never show fear, they can smell it. I'm under King Constantine's protection. Harming me is an act of war against the Crimson Court. The king, another had laughed, is being challenged as we speak. Lord Draven has invoked the old rights. While your precious Constantine fights for his throne, we'll take what's owed to us. Terror had shot through Lysandra's chest. Constantine was fighting for his throne. What's owed? She'd managed to ask, still backing away. Blood, the third had said simply. Royal blood carries power. You're soaked in it, little human. Consuming you will give us a taste of the king's strength. They'd moved then, fast as striking snakes, and Lysandra had done the only thing she could. She'd run. Her new abilities had saved her life. The vampire blood in her system had made her faster, stronger, able to dodge the first grab and duck under the second. She'd made it to the garden entrance before they'd caught her, one of them grabbing her arm with a grip that had felt like iron. Then, Constantine had been there. She hadn't seen him arrive, had only felt the sudden absence of the hand on her arm and heard the sound of impact. The rogue vampire had been thrown across the garden hard enough to shatter a stone bench. Constantine had stood where he'd appeared, and for the first time, Lysandra had seen the king not as the controlled, careful teacher she'd come to know, but as the apex predator he truly was. Power had radiated from him like heat, making the air itself feel heavy. His eyes had been blazing, fangs fully extended, and when he'd spoken, his voice had carried command that had made even Lysandra's knees weak. You dare touch what is mine. The other two rogues had frozen, terror replacing their earlier confidence. My lord, we didn't, Lord Draven said. Lord Draven is currently having his spine reattached, Constantine had interrupted coldly. It turns out challenging me to ritual combat was the last mistake he'll make, and you've made yours by threatening my blood marked. He'd moved again, too fast for Lysandra's enhanced eyes to fully track, and the two standing rogues had crumpled. Not dead, she'd seen their chests still moving, but completely incapacitated. Then Constantine had turned to her, and the rage had drained from his features, replaced by something close to panic. Are you hurt? He'd crossed to her, hands hovering over her arms, her shoulders, checking for injury with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence of seconds before. Did they bite you? Touch you beyond grabbing your arm? I'm fine, Lysandra had managed, though she'd been shaking. You were fighting? For your throne? Of formality. Draven was a fool who thought 800 years made me weak. I disabused him of that notion. His hands had settled on her shoulders, gripping carefully. But I should have been here, should have stationed guards. If they'd hurt you. They didn't, she'd interrupted, and without thinking, she'd stepped closer, needing the strange comfort of his presence. You came in time. Constantine had stood very still, his cool hands steady on her shoulders. I felt your fear through the blood bond, felt the moment you started to run. I've never moved faster in my entire existence. Blood bond. It was the first she'd heard the term. The connection between us. It's grown stronger than I anticipated. He'd said it quietly, almost to himself. I can sense you, Lysandra. Your emotions, your location, your physical state. It should have faded by now, but instead, it deepens every day. She'd looked up at him, at the ancient creature who'd saved her life twice now, and felt something shift in her chest. Does it go both ways? What? Can I sense you? He'd seemed surprised by the question. You shouldn't be able to. Humans don't. He'd cut off as Lysandra had lifted her hand and placed it over his silent heart. You're worried, she'd said softly, suddenly certain. Not about the challenge to your throne. About me. You're afraid something will happen to me, and it's making you doubt yourself. Constantine had stared at her like she'd performed magic. That's not possible. But I'm right, aren't I? His hands had moved from her shoulders to her face, cradling her jaw with a tenderness that had stolen her breath. You terrify me, he'd admitted. In 800 years, nothing has terrified me like the thought of losing you. Lysandra's heart had been pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. Why? I'm just a human, fragile, temporary. In 100 years I'll be dust. Then I'll treasure the time I have, Constantine had said, and he'd leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She hadn't pulled away. The kiss had been soft, careful, cold lips against warm ones. He'd tasted like winter nights and dark wine, and the bond between them had flared bright enough that Lysandra had gasped against his mouth. She'd felt his emotions then, clear as her own, the loneliness of centuries, the surprise of caring again, the fierce protectiveness that bordered on obsession, and underneath it all, something that might have been love in its earliest, most fragile form. When they'd parted, Constantine had rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed. "I shouldn't want this. You deserve a mortal life, warmth, children, growing old with someone who ages beside you." "What if I don't want that?" Lysandra had whispered. "What if I want this? Want you? Then you're as much a fool as I am." "Good thing we match." He'd laughed, and it had been such a rare, genuine sound that Lysandra had committed it to memory. Then he'd kissed her again, deeper this time, and she'd stopped thinking about what she should want versus what she did want. The weeks that followed had transformed Lysandra's existence completely. She was no longer a maid or even just a blood-marked human. She'd become something the court whispered about with equal parts fascination and wariness, the Vampire King's consort. Constantine had been careful with her, conscious of his strength and her remaining humanity. But behind closed doors, he'd let himself be vulnerable in ways Lysandra suspected he hadn't been in centuries. He'd told her about his mortal life, about the family he'd lost to plague, about the crushing weight of immortality and leadership. And she'd listened, offered comfort, and slowly helped him remember what it felt like to be something more than just a king. In return, he'd shown her wonders, the true extent of the underground realm, which sprawled beneath the entire city in a network of courts and chambers, the vampire library, which held books thought lost to human history, the blood treaties that kept peace between the 7 great courts, the delicate balance of power that prevented supernatural war, and he'd taught her to fight. "You can't become a full vampire without dying and rising again," he'd explained during their first training session. "And I will never ask that of you. But my blood has made you more than human, faster, stronger, harder to kill. We'll enhance those gifts until you can defend yourself." The training had been brutal but effective. Constantine had been a patient teacher, but he'd never held back completely, arguing that she needed to experience real combat to survive it. Lysandra had collected a colorful array of bruises and scrapes that had healed with supernatural speed thanks to the vampire blood in her system. She'd also discovered she had an aptitude for it. Years of managing a fragile body had made her strategic, efficient with her movements. She'd learned to use her smaller size as an advantage, to read her opponent's intentions in the shift of their weight, to strike fast and retreat before retaliation could land. "You're a natural," Constantine had said after she'd managed to land a blow that would have stunned a lesser vampire. Pride had shone in his eyes, and Lysandra had felt it echo through their bond. The bond itself had become a constant presence, a thread of awareness connecting them no matter where they were in the vast underground estate. She'd feel his amusement during boring court proceedings, his satisfaction when resolving disputes, his fierce protectiveness whenever she interacted with vampires he didn't fully trust. And he'd feel her emotions in return, her curiosity, her growing confidence, her deepening feelings for him. They hadn't spoken the word love yet. It felt too large, too significant for something so new. But Lysandra had felt it growing between them like a living thing, fed by every conversation, every touch, every moment of understanding. Then, one evening, 3 months after Constantine had first saved her life, everything had changed again. Lysandra had been in the library, researching blood bonds in the ancient texts, when Celestine had rushed in with an expression of barely controlled panic. "You need to hide, now." Lysandra had stood immediately, the mark on her soul going cold with warning. "What's wrong?" "The Shadow Assembly has sent an envoy. Lady Morgathis herself. She's here to inspect the court and ensure the king is maintaining the treaty." Celestine had grabbed Lysandra's arm, pulling her toward a hidden door. "She can't know about you. If she discovers Constantine has blood marked a human, she'll use it against him. The other courts already think he's growing weak, soft. A human consort would be proof." "I'm not hiding like something shameful," Lysandra had protested, even as fear curled in her stomach. This isn't about shame. It's about politics and survival." Celestine's eyes had been desperate. "Lady Morgathis is old, Lysandra. Older than Constantine by millennia. She has the power to strip him of his territory if she believes he's violated the treaties, and romantic attachment to a human could be interpreted as dangerous instability." Before Lysandra could argue further, Constantine's voice had echoed through the bond, sharp with command. "Lysandra, stay in the library. Don't come out until I send for you." She'd wanted to refuse, to march into whatever confrontation was happening and stand beside him, but the edge of fear in his mental voice had stopped her. He was genuinely worried, and if an 800-year-old vampire king was worried, she should probably listen. So she'd let Celestine hide her in a reading alcove behind a section of books on ancient blood magic, and she'd waited. The hours had crawled by. Through the bond, she'd felt Constantine's careful control, the mental shields he'd erected to hide his emotions from both her and presumably Lady Morgathis. The absence of his presence in her mind had felt wrong, like losing a sense she'd come to depend on. Finally, after what felt like days but was probably only 5 hours, Constantine's presence had rushed back into her awareness. "Come to my chambers. We need to talk." The walk to his rooms had felt endless. Lysandra had passed vampires who'd watched her with knowing eyes, and she'd wondered how many of them had already guessed the truth. She was terrible at subterfuge. Every emotion she felt had probably been written across her face. Constantine had been standing at the window when she had entered, looking out at the eternal twilight of the underground gardens. He hadn't turned when she'd closed the door. "She knows," he'd said quietly, "or suspects. Morgathis is ancient and cunning. She sensed the bond between us the moment she entered my territory." Lysandra's heart had sunk. "What does that mean?" "It means she's given me a choice." Finally he'd turned, and the anguish in his expression had stolen her breath. "I can sever the bond, ensure you're relocated to the human world with enough money to live comfortably, and she'll overlook this lapse in judgment. Or I can keep you, claim you publicly as my consort, and face a formal challenge to my authority from the other courts." "A challenge?" "They'll argue I've been compromised. That attachment to a human makes me unfit to rule. There will be trials, combat challenges, political maneuvering. It could take years to resolve, and there's no guarantee I'd win." His hands had clenched into fists. "I've held this territory for 300 years, maintained peace, protected both vampires and humans through careful balance. All of that could crumble because I couldn't bear to let one fragile human die." Lysandra had crossed to him, taking his cold hands in her warm ones. "Then sever the bond." He'd looked at her like she'd stabbed him. "What?" "If keeping me means losing everything you've built, everything you protect, then let me go. I'm not worth that cost." "You are worth everything," Constantine had said fiercely, pulling her against his chest. "You are worth centuries of peace, worth my throne, worth my immortal life. That's the problem. I would burn the world for you, and that makes me dangerous." "Then what do we do?" He'd been quiet for a long moment, his arms around her, his silent heart pressed against her living one. When he'd spoken, his voice had been steady with decision. "We fight, not because I can't let you go, but because I won't. You didn't ask for this life, but you've embraced it. You've learned our ways, earned respect from my court, proven yourself more than just a fragile human. If they want to challenge me, let them. I've faced worse odds." "The other courts are afraid," he'd interrupted, "afraid that I've found something they've forgotten: connection, purpose beyond simple survival and power. They'll fight because they don't understand, but that doesn't mean they'll win." Lysandra had looked up at him, at the ancient king who'd chosen to fight the world for a woman he'd known for only 3 months. "I love you," she'd said, the words spilling out before she could second-guess them. "I know it's fast, I know it's probably the bond talking, but I don't care. I love you." Constantine's expression had transformed, centuries of control cracking to show raw emotion beneath. "The bond doesn't create feelings, Lysandra. It only amplifies what's already there. And he'd cupped her face in his hands, thumbs brushing her cheekbones. "I have lived 800 years. I have known love in my mortal life, lust in my immortal one. What I feel for you transcends both. If that is love, then yes. I love you beyond reason, beyond sense, beyond the very survival instinct that has kept me alive for centuries." She'd kissed him then, pouring everything she felt through the bond and the touch of her lips, and he'd kissed her back like she was air and he'd been drowning. When they'd finally parted, Constantine's eyes had been burning with determination. "Tomorrow I make the formal announcement. You'll be recognized as my consort before all 7 courts. There will be challenges, but we'll face them together." "Together," Lysandra had agreed. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The attack had come at dawn, the one time when vampires were at their weakest, retreating to dark chambers to escape the sun. Lysandra had been asleep in Constantine's rooms, wrapped in blackout curtains and the false security of the underground estate. She'd woken to the sound of screaming. The bond had blazed with Constantine's rage and fear, and she'd stumbled out of bed to find Celestine bursting through the door. "Hunters!" the vampire had gasped, her usual composure shattered. "A full squad, armed with daylight weapons. They've breached the upper levels and are working their way down. The king is evacuating the court, but—" She'd looked at Lysandra with stricken eyes. "They're asking for you by name." Ice had flooded Lysandra's veins. "What?" "Someone told them about you, about the bond. They think killing you will weaken the king, make him easier to destroy." Celestine had grabbed Lysandra's arm, pulling her toward the door. "We need to get you to the deep vaults. They're the most fortified." An explosion had rocked the estate, close enough to send books tumbling from shelves. Shouting had echoed through the corridors, along with sounds of combat, and through the bond, Lysandra had felt Constantine's absolute terror. "Lysandra, run." His voice in her mind had been raw. "Get to the vaults and seal yourself in. I'll come for you when it's safe." But running had never been Lysandra's strength. She'd spent too many years being the fragile one, the protected one. And now, with vampire blood singing in her veins and the man she loved fighting for both their lives, she'd made a choice. "Where are the hunters?" she'd asked Celestine. "Lysandra, no. Where?" Celestine had hesitated, then her expression had hardened with understanding. "North corridor, 2 levels up. But you can't. I'm the bait they want. Let me give them a target." She'd grabbed the blade Constantine had given her for training, the silver one that could kill even vampires if wielded correctly. "Trust me." She'd run before Celestine could stop her, following the sounds of battle and the pull of the bond that told her exactly where Constantine was fighting. The estate had been chaos vampires fleeing the upper levels where sunlight had been brought in through shattered windows, hunters in tactical gear pushing deeper, weapons gleaming with silver and sanctified metals. Lysandra had made it to the north corridor to find Constantine surrounded. 5 hunters, all armed, all focused on the vampire king who'd been wounded and bleeding. His white hair had been matted with blood darker than human vitae, his coat shredded. But he'd been fighting with the fury of something ancient and cornered, taking down hunters even as they'd landed blow after blow. Then, he'd seen her, and his concentration had wavered for just a moment. That moment had been enough. A hunter had fired, not at Constantine, but at Lysandra. The bullet had been silver, blessed, designed to stop even supernatural creatures, and it had hit her square in the chest. The pain had been immediate and absolute. Lysandra had felt her legs give out, had felt warm blood spreading across her shirt. But more than the physical agony, she'd felt Constantine's anguish explode through the bond, a psychic scream of denial and rage. What happened next, she'd only known from the stories told afterward. Constantine had stopped fighting like a warrior and started fighting like a force of nature. He'd torn through the hunters with his bare hands, moving so fast that the survivors would later claim he'd been in multiple places at once. By the time the last hunter had fallen, the north corridor had been a massacre, and Constantine had been cradling Lysandra's dying body against his chest. "No," he'd said, voice breaking. "No, not like this. Not after everything." Lysandra had tried to speak, but her lungs had been filling with blood. The wound had been too severe, even for vampire-enhanced healing. She'd felt her consciousness starting to slip, the world graying at the edges. Through the fading bond, she'd felt Constantine's absolute despair. Then, cutting through it, a desperate decision. "Forgive me," he'd whispered, and she'd felt his fangs pierce his own wrist. "Forgive me, but I cannot let you go." The fainting maid was nearly gone, so the vampire king pressed his bleeding wrist to her lips one final time. This time, the blood hadn't been about healing. It had been about transformation. "Drink," Constantine had commanded, power and grief making his voice resonate. "Drink and live, drink and choose. Drink and come back to me." The blood had hit her tongue, and even through the dying haze, Lysandra had tasted the difference. This wasn't healing blood. This was making blood, offered deliberately, with full knowledge of what it would do. She'd had a choice in that moment. She could refuse, let herself slip away, die human and mortal. Or she could drink and embrace transformation into something other than what she'd been born. Lysandra had chosen to drink. The transformation had been agony. Every cell in her body had been rewritten, human weakness burned away and replaced with supernatural strength. Her failing heart had stopped completely, then restarted with a rhythm that would never fail again. The silver bullet had been pushed out of her chest by healing flesh that knit itself together seamlessly. And through it all, Constantine had held her, pouring his ancient blood into her, whispering words in languages long dead, begging her to survive. When Lysandra had opened her eyes again, the world had been different. Colors had been sharper, sounds clearer, scents overwhelming in their complexity. She'd felt strong, whole, powerful in a way she'd never experienced. And when she'd looked up at Constantine, she'd seen him in new spectrum. The bond between them had no longer been a subtle thread, but a blazing connection, bright as the sun she'd never see again. "I'm sorry," he'd said, tears of blood tracking down his white cheeks. "I couldn't let you die. Even if you hate me for this, I couldn't." Lysandra had kissed him, stopping the words. She'd tasted her own blood on his lips, mixed with his, and had felt no regret, only certainty. "I don't hate you," she'd said when they'd parted, marveling at the new strength in her voice. "I chose this, chose you, chose forever." Constantine had crushed her against him, holding her like she might disappear if he let go. Around them, the sounds of battle had been fading as the surviving hunters had retreated and the court vampires had rallied. But in that moment, none of it had mattered except the two of them, the ancient king and his newly turned queen, bound by blood and choice and something deeper than either. The aftermath had been complicated. The other courts had been furious about the Hunter attack, which had been revealed to be orchestrated by a faction within the Shadow Assembly vampires who'd thought Constantine weakened by his attachment to a human. Lady Morgathis herself had been outraged at the betrayal within her own court and had publicly executed those responsible. But the transformation had changed everything. Lysandra was no longer a human consort who might die in a century. She was a vampire now, Constantine's equal in immortality, if not yet in power. The other courts couldn't argue about the instability of a mortal attachment when that mortal no longer existed. Still, there had been challenges. Lysandra's transformation had been abrupt, without the usual preparation and training. She'd had to learn to control her new strength, her bloodlust, the overwhelming sensory input. Constantine had been patient, teaching her what his sire had taught him centuries ago, and slowly she'd adapted. She'd learned to hunt ethically, taking blood from willing donors or animals. She'd learned to move among vampires as one of them, rather than as a curiosity. She'd learned to wield the power that came with being blood-bonded to one of the oldest vampires in existence. Most importantly, she'd learned what it meant to be Constantine's partner in truth, not just his consort, but his co-ruler, his advisor, his equal. Together, they'd begun reshaping the Crimson Court into something new, a place where the old ways were honored but also questioned, where immortals remembered what it meant to value individual lives instead of seeing centuries as disposable. The formal announcement of Lysandra's position had come 6 months after her transformation. Before representatives of all 7 courts, Constantine had stood with her hand in his and declared her his queen. There had been whispers, objections from the older vampires who thought a turned human too new, too weak. Then, Lysandra had demonstrated exactly what Constantine's blood had made her capable of, defeating 3 challengers in ritual combat with the skills he'd taught her and the supernatural speed her new existence granted. After that, the whispers had quieted. Now, a year after the night Constantine had first pressed his bleeding wrist to a dying maid's lips, Lysandra stood on the balcony of their underground palace and marveled at the strange path her life had taken. Constantine joined her, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice soft against her ear. "About dying," Lysandra admitted. "About lying on that guest room floor, certain I was breathing my last breaths. If someone had told me then that a year later I'd be here, like this," she'd gestured at herself, at the vampiric existence she'd never imagined, "I wouldn't have believed it. Do you regret it?" The question was casual, but she'd felt the tension in his body, the fear underneath. Lysandra had turned in his arms, looking up at the vampire who'd saved her, transformed her, and loved her beyond reason. Not for a single moment. His smile had been radiant, and he'd kissed her with the passion of someone who'd thought he'd lost her, and still couldn't quite believe she'd stayed. Through their bond, she'd felt his love, his relief, his absolute devotion. "I have something for you," Constantine had said when they'd parted. He'd pulled a small box from his pocket, opening it to reveal a ring. Not a modern engagement ring, but something older, a band of silver and obsidian set with a blood-red ruby that seemed to glow with inner light. This was my mother's, he'd explained. The only thing I kept from my mortal life. I want you to have it. Lysandra had felt tears prick her eyes, one of the few human traits that had survived transformation. Constantine, marry me, he'd said simply. By human custom and vampire right. Be my wife in all the ways that matter. Choose me as I chose you. You already saved my life twice and made me immortal, Lysandra had pointed out, laughing through her tears. Isn't that commitment enough? Not nearly. I want everything. Every promise, every vow, every bond that can tie us together across eternity. His crimson eyes had been blazing with sincerity. Marry me, Lysandra Thornhill. Let me spend forever proving I made the right choice when I couldn't bear to watch you die. She'd kissed him instead of answering, pouring her acceptance through the bond and the touch of her lips. When she'd finally pulled back, she'd held out her hand, letting him slide the ring onto her finger. Yes, she'd said, knowing the word was redundant when he'd already felt her answer through their connection. Yes to everything. The wedding had been a blend of vampire tradition and human sentiment, held in the underground palace with representatives from all 7 courts in attendance. Lysandra had worn white, a human custom, but the dress had been made of fabric that seemed to shift between solid and shadow, courtesy of vampire weavers who'd worked textile magic for centuries. Constantine had worn the formal regalia of his station, looking every inch the ancient king he was. But when she'd walked down the aisle on Celestine's arm, her vampire friend who'd become something like a sister, he'd looked at her with all the wonder of someone experiencing something precious for the first time. The ceremony itself had been conducted in Old Vampiric, the ancient language that predated Latin, with translations for Lysandra's benefit. They'd exchanged blood instead of rings, a deeper bond than the one they already shared, a marriage bond that would link them across any distance, any time. When the officiant had declared them wed before all courts and gods, old and new, Constantine had kissed her like she was the only thing that mattered in all his centuries of existence. The celebration afterward had lasted 3 nights, as was vampire custom. There had been blood wine and dancing, music from every era Constantine had lived through, and toasts from vampires who'd initially doubted but had come to respect the strange love between the ancient king and his turned human queen. Lady Morgathis herself had attended, the ancient vampire who'd almost destroyed them, now offering her blessing. You surprised us all, she'd told Lysandra during a quiet moment. A human who became something more, who helped an old king remember why immortality is worth living. The courts could use more surprises like you. Now, standing in their private chambers after the last guest had departed, Lysandra and Constantine were finally alone. How does it feel to be married to a vampire? Constantine had asked, pulling her close. Strange. Wonderful. Right. Lysandra had looked up at him, at the being who'd become her entire world. How does it feel to be married to someone who used to clean your guest rooms? Like the luckiest creature in existence. They'd made love then, not with the desperate urgency of those early months, but with the steady certainty of forever. They'd had time now, all the time in the world, to learn each other, to grow together, to build something that would outlast empires. Afterward, lying in Constantine's arms in the darkness of their chambers, Lysandra had thought about the path that had brought her here, the blood disorder that should have killed her, the desperate application to a mysterious estate, the wrong turn that had revealed a secret world, the dying breaths on a rich person's carpet. Every moment had led to this, to immortality and love, to power and partnership, to a life beyond anything she'd imagined. What are you thinking about now? Constantine had asked, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her back. About fate, Lysandra had admitted. About how I was dying for years, and you saved me in more ways than one. I was dying too, Constantine had said quietly. Just more slowly. Dying of loneliness and purpose worn thin by centuries. You saved me just as surely. She'd lifted her head to look at him. Then we saved each other. We did. And will continue to, every night, for as long as forever lasts. Lysandra had smiled, feeling the bond between them pulse with warmth and certainty. Forever sounds perfect. Years passed, human years that meant little to immortal beings. Lysandra grew into her power, becoming not just Constantine's queen, but a force in vampire politics in her own right. She'd advocated for changes in how the courts interacted with humans, pushing for more ethical feeding practices and better protection of the mortal world they all depended on. Some vampires had resisted, clinging to old ways, but Lysandra had learned to be as diplomatic as she was strong, building alliances and proving that respecting human life didn't mean weakness. Constantine had supported her completely, using his ancient authority to enforce the changes she proposed. Together, they'd modernized the Crimson Court while maintaining the traditions that gave vampires their identity. They'd also traveled, once Lysandra had learned to tolerate the stasis coffins that allowed vampires to move during daylight hours. They'd visited the other great courts, seen vampire kingdoms hidden beneath cities around the world, met immortals who'd lived through events Lysandra had only read about in history books. Through it all, the bond between them had only grown stronger. They'd learned to communicate without words, to sense each other's needs and thoughts. They'd become so synchronized that other vampires sometimes referred to them as a single entity, the twin sovereigns of the Crimson Court. But they'd remained individuals too, with separate interests and passions. Constantine had continued his work preserving vampire history and mediating disputes between courts. Lysandra had started a foundation that provided medical care to humans with rare blood disorders, funding research that might prevent others from suffering as she had. She'd also written about her experiences, keeping journals that documented the strange life of a turned human adapting to immortality. Constantine had laughed when he'd found them, asking if she planned to publish them someday. "Maybe in a few centuries," Lysandra had said, "when enough time has passed that people will think it's fiction." They'd made a home together in every sense of the word. The underground palace had become a place of warmth despite its eternal darkness, filled with Lysandra's books and Constantine's collections, their combined lives creating something neither had managed alone. And on quiet nights, when the court business was handled and the world above slept, they'd retreat to their chambers and simply exist together. Constantine would play music on instruments he'd mastered over centuries, while Lysandra read or painted a hobby she'd developed with her new supernatural precision. Sometimes they'd talk about the future, making plans that stretched decades and centuries ahead. Sometimes they'd reminisce about the past, Constantine sharing memories of ages long gone while Lysandra contributed her shorter but no less precious human experiences. And sometimes they'd simply hold each other, letting the bond between them communicate what words couldn't, the depth of love that had started with a desperate choice and had grown into something that would outlast ages. On their 50th wedding anniversary, a minor milestone by vampire standards, but when Lysandra had insisted on celebrating, Constantine had presented her with a portrait. It showed two figures, a vampire king with white hair and crimson eyes standing beside a woman in a maid's uniform. The woman was gray and fading, clearly dying, while the king held his bleeding wrist to her lips. But the artist had captured something beyond the physical scene, the moment when two souls had recognized each other, when love had first sparked in the space between life and death. "I commissioned it years ago," Constantine had explained, "from an artist who specializes in capturing significant moments. I wanted to remember the night my immortal life truly began." Lysandra had studied the portrait, seeing herself as she'd been fragile, frightened, fading, and seeing Constantine as he'd been in that moment, desperate, determined, already falling in love even if he hadn't recognized it yet. "We were so different then," she'd said softly, "and yet exactly who we needed to be. If you'd been stronger, healthier, you might never have needed my blood. If I'd been more cynical, more hardened by centuries, I might have let you die." "Fate," Lysandra had said, echoing a conversation from decades past. "Fate," Constantine had agreed, "or luck, or the universe's strange sense of humor. Whatever it was, I'm grateful for it every night of my existence." She'd kissed him then, and the bond between them had resonated with 50 years of accumulated love, growing stronger rather than fading with familiarity. The portrait had been hung in their private chambers, a reminder of where they'd started, and as centuries continued to pass, it would remain a frozen moment when a dying maid and a vampire king had chosen each other and changed both their eternities. Lysandra had never regretted the choice to drink, to transform, to embrace an immortal existence she'd never asked for. Because with Constantine beside her, forever didn't seem daunting. It seemed like exactly enough time to explore the love they'd built from blood and desperation and impossible odds. They'd faced challenges over the years, political intrigue, threats from outside the vampire courts, the occasional fanatic hunter. But they'd faced everything together, their bond making them stronger than the sum of their parts. And in quiet moments, when Lysandra felt overwhelmed by the weight of immortality, Constantine would remind her of that first night. "You were dying," he'd say, "and I couldn't let you go. That hasn't changed. I still can't let you go, won't let you go, not in 100 years or 1,000 or 1,000,000. "Good," Lysandra would always reply, "because I'm not going anywhere." The underground gardens where they'd first kissed had become their favorite retreat. The night-blooming flowers had been joined by plants. Lysandra had introduced roses bred to thrive without sunlight, trees that grew in eternal twilight, vines that climbed the ancient stone walls and made the stark chambers feel alive. They'd walk there often, hand in hand, talking about everything and nothing, planning their next century, discussing books they'd read and art they'd seen, or simply enjoying the comfortable silence of two beings who knew each other completely. One evening, exactly 100 years after Constantine had first pressed his bleeding wrist to a dying maid's lips, they stood together in that garden beneath the eternal stars painted on the cavern's ceiling. "A century," Lysandra had marveled. "I've been immortal for a century." "The first of many," Constantine had said, pulling her into his arms. "Are you ever afraid it will fade? This feeling between us?" He'd considered the question seriously. "I've had 1,000 years to grow bored with existence. I've seen everything, experienced everything, until it all became mundane. Then you stumbled into my life and made the world new again. If that hasn't faded in a century, I don't believe it ever will." "Promise me something," Lysandra had said, looking up at him. Anything. "Promise me that in another 100 years, another 1,000 years, we'll still do this. Still walk in gardens and talk about nothing important. Still find joy in each other, even when the world has changed around us." Constantine had cupped her face in his cool hands, his crimson eyes serious. "I promise that as long as I exist, you will be my wonder, my joy, my reason for greeting each night. I promise that I will love you in 100 years, exactly as I love you now, completely, eternally, without reservation or doubt." "I promise the same," Lysandra had said, and she'd meant it with every fiber of her immortal being. They'd sealed the promise with a kiss, and the bond between them had blazed bright enough that nearby vampires would later claim they'd seen light emanating from the garden impossible in the underground realm, but no more impossible than a dying human becoming a vampire queen and finding forever in the arms of an ancient king. As they'd stood there, wrapped in each other in the certainty of their love, Lysandra had thought back to that girl dying on a carpet, convinced she was alone. If she could go back and tell her past self what waited ahead, the pain of transformation, yes, but also the incredible love, the purpose, the life, beyond anything she'd dreamed, would she have believed it? Probably not, but she would have been grateful nonetheless, because the fainting maid who'd been nearly gone had found something worth living for in the moment the vampire king had pressed his bleeding wrist to her lips. She'd found love, power, purpose, and forever. And that, Lysandra had decided, was the best kind of happy ending, not perfect, not easy, but true. A love that had been forged in desperation and blood, tested by political intrigue and violence, and had emerged stronger for all of it. She'd saved Constantine from his loneliness as surely as he'd saved her from death. They'd transformed each other in ways that went beyond supernatural blood, becoming better versions of themselves through their partnership. And they would continue to do so, night after night, century after century, for as long as forever lasted, which, for two immortals bound by blood and choice and love, was exactly long enough.